Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we're back on the episode of Cheap Shots, the series dedicated to showing you how to save money on the wargaming hobby. And on today's episode, we'll show you how to paint up the Beastmen Brayherd Gors both quickly and more importantly cheaply for your games of Warhammer the Old World. By following the tips, techniques, and materials that we suggest, you can paint your miniatures to a beautiful tabletop standard for less than $28. And when compared for the materials that you need to buy from Army Painter as well as Citadel, will help you save over $139 at exactly the same time. So as you can see in this photo, this is what the end result will look like by following our tutorial. So with that being said, let's talk about how to cheaply paint up some Beastmen Gors. Now the first thing we do with these miniatures, of course, is to prime them, and I'm going to prime them all in flat red primer by Rust-Oleum. I could buy this at my local Walmart for about $3.99. It's a beautiful reddish brown kind of color, kind of like a rusted look, and I really like the way that the color looks. And the reason why is because if I want to paint these guys up very quickly, it's very easy for me to do so. All I have necessarily to do is just do some dry brushing real quick, add some flesh tones, and most of the miniatures is basically completed because you don't necessarily need to paint the entirety of the hindquarters. All you gotta do is just dry brush them with a different color just to create that same look. Now I will warn you, if you decide to do that, it does kind of create a boring kind of look for your miniatures. That's why I added some color variations in my painting scheme for my unit. But if you wanted to, you can actually make it as basic as you want to, if you really, especially if you try to paint these up for like a tournament or something like that. Now, of course, you could use a base spray that's offered by Army Painter. I believe it's called Fur Brown is what it's called, and it does exactly the same thing. The only problem though is it costs is what, 5 times as much with that $17.99 for that can as opposed to a $3.99 can from Walmart. So immediately afterwards, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to dry brush. We're going to dry brush the entirety of the miniatures with Territorial Beige by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. And I just do a quick dry brush all over the entirety of the miniatures that I just sprayed earlier with flat red primer. And as you can see, it does actually a very good job of picking out those skin tones as well as the fur. Technically speaking, we could go straight towards the clothing as well as metallic elements on these miniatures. But like I said, that's a little bit boring if you decide to do that. I like a little bit more color variety for my units, but if you're looking for a very fast, effective way to paint your miniatures, this would actually do about half the job for you, and it only took us like what, I think 5 minutes to get that done. For me, however, because I'm a glutton for punishment, I decided to add some color variations for the skin tones for my miniatures. And as you can see, what I decided to do is break them up between 4 different color types. For 6 of these guys, I painted up using normal flesh tone from Apple Barrel Paint. It's a good mid-tone flesh color. You get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. And for 6 of these guys, I decided to leave that red Rust-Oleum flat primer that I use for their chests, and I decided to paint their hindquarters in 2 thin layers of burnt umber, so that way there's a lot of variety in both skin tones as well as furs that these characters are wearing as well. And then for 3 of these fighters, I decided to paint their skin in 2 layers of pigment paint, also another Apple Barrel product from Walmart for about 50 cents. And for the last 3, I decided to paint them with a paler skin tone using taupe gray by Needs Acrylic, which costs 65 cents. You can get these materials, of course, from your local Walmart or Hobby Lobby. Just do 2 thin coats of that, and then we're ready to move on to our dry brushing. So we're going to concentrate on the flesh of these characters for our dry brushing. For the ones I did in the normal flesh color by Apple Barrel Paint, I decided to dry brush those guys in a quick layer of Peaches and Cream by Delta Cerakote. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. For the ones that I did with the brown hindquarters, I decided to dry brush those guys in normal Apple Barrel Flesh. I'll just add a little bit more detail for that. For the guys I did with the pale taupe gray in the last slide, I decided to use Apple Barrel Ivory Paint. And for the guys I did in pavement, I decided to do a quick dry brush in Folk Arts Pale Gray. And as you can see, it does a beautiful job of bringing out a lot of those musculature that we couldn't see earlier while leaving those darker colors in the recesses. And because after I got done with that, I decided that having enough color variety for the fur wasn't enough for me, I decided to go on an extra layer by adding some more fur colors to the hindquarters. For 2 of these guys, I decided to paint their hindquarters in pavement paint by Apple Barrel, and for 4 of these guys, I decided to use pewter gray, which you can get your local one for about 50 cents, just because apparently I'm a glutton for punishment and I don't like doing things easily. So for the fur of these guys, we decided to dry brush them in Folk Art Pale Gray for the ones that we did in Pewter Gray earlier, and Pewter Gray for the ones that we did in Pavement earlier as well. Just to add that little bit of color variety besides just using mid-to-range browns for the fur on the hindquarters of these guys. Like I said, you could easily do it the way I originally intended, which is a much faster way. However, I found it to be a little bit more visually boring doing it that way, so I made it this way to make it more visually appealing. So now that we got the flesh as well as the fur completed, the next we got to do now is start working on the hooves. And as you can see from most of these guys, I decided to use pavement paint for their hooves on the guys on the left hand side for a vast majority of the group. The ones who do on the right hand side had the off colors, which was gray as well as black that I used for their fur. I decided to pick out that detail into the layers of territorial beige as well to create that a little bit more of a contrast. I don't want these guys to kind of blend together too quickly. I want to add some color variety, and that's the best way to do so. So the next major detail we're going to work on are all the wooden elements on these characters as well. These guys are carrying huge shields made out of wood, as well as weapons with like axes and picks and maces and things, as well as the pole of the standard bearer. So for all the wood elements these characters are creating, I decided to pick down 2 thin layers of burnt umber. It's a rich, beautiful dark color that contrasts nicely with the flesh tones we're using on these guys. I just put quick 2 thin layers all over all the wooden elements on these miniatures, and ready to move on to our next detail, which will be the horns and antlers. And because these guys are beastmen, they do have horns as well as skulls all over the place that these guys are carrying, as well as like bone looking shivs that they use for like close combat weapon. So for all those bone elements, I decided to use light mocha of apple barrel paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. And I decided to use this for all the bone elements that you're seeing. So things like the antlers, the skulls along their waist, the bone shivs they're carrying, the horn that's being blown by the musician, as well as the adornments on their shields, as well as on the standard bearer as well. So I'm going to find all those elements, just pick that at 2 thin layers of light mocha. And once we're done with that, we're going to dry brush those details. And we're going to dry brush those bone details real fast with Ivory by Apple Barrel Paint, and the reason why is because it's a nice contrasting color to all the light mocha that we did earlier, and it also brings out a lot of those details that we couldn't see earlier as well. Now you will notice later on I will decide to change a little bit on the banner that's being held. I decided to actually pick out the horns on that banner using pavement paint in order to create some color differences between the skulls as well as the horns, and you'll see that later on as the video continues. So we're going back to our color of territorial beige, and this time we're using it as a dry brush for all the wooden elements that we did earlier. So as you can see on the close-up, especially with the guys in the center frame, these are the guys who actually have, you can see the individual wood grains on their shields as well as the shafts of their weapons. So I decided to bring out those details so that way you can see that wood grain element to make it look really awesome as well, because I thought it looked kind of neat. At the same time, it also brings out those details we couldn't see before. So next element we're going to work on are all the leather goods for these characters. Now unfortunately I didn't do a very good job of actually capturing the leather goods, so I do apologize for that. What I should have done is actually taken these miniatures and turned them backwards, because along their their backs they have belts that they wear in order to keep their loincloths as well as their weapons and equipment attached to them. I'm not sure why I didn't take the picture of the back end. That's just kind of an oversight in my opinion. So because of that, for most of these guys I use pavement paint for that thin band of leather that they have on the small of their backs for their belts, and for the guys on the right hand side I use territorial beige. Now the reason why I did that is because if there's a darker skin tone like the pavement or if their fur hindquarters are a black color or a really dark color, I use that territorial beige in order to create that contrast between the darker skin tone as well as the leather goods. While the guys on the left hand side have either lighter skin tones or lighter flesh tones, so I use the pavement paint in order to bring out that detail. So that's the reason why I'm using 2 different colors for the leather, so that way you can see it better on the overall miniature. So the next major detail we're going to focus on next are on the fabric that these characters are wearing as well, and I decided to go with 3 major colors for that. I used green turquoise for about 6 of these guys. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. I did for 6 of these guys, I decided to use Holly Branch for Apple Barrel Paint, and then for the other 6 guys, I decided to use Tuscan Teal by Apple Barrel Paint for those guys. I did things like all the fabric they're wearing, the cording of their weapons, the flag of the banner pole that the guys being carried, the cording around the grips of their weapons, for example, the ribbons that are holding on, the pieces of cord that's holding on their skulls and other adornments to their shields. These are the colors I use, and the reason why I use these 3 colors is because they contrast quite nicely with the browns and earth tones that are in this army. I'm a really big fan of the teal color scheme. I just kind of found that out on my own as I gone through my miniatures painting, so I decided to put a lot of these elements in this particular army because it contrasts so nicely with brown, which is what the main component is for most of this army. So immediately after painting the fabric, the next thing we do, of course, is to paint the bases. Now, usually I do a dry brush with the fabric, but I didn't do that this time around, and the reason why is because I'm going to use the same color for the fabric as I am for the bases. So the bases, I use Tuscan Teal on all the round bases, and as you can see, the miniatures are actually standing on some sculpted Age of Sigmar type bases. I believe it's called Days of Ruin. I forgot the name of the actual box of bases are, but they have very textured bases with skulls and cracks and damaged masonry as well as bas-relief artwork on the bases. I bought these miniatures secondhand from a guy who was playing Age of Sigmar, and he did that with these miniatures and put them on these really cool looking bases, so I decided to just use that color from my masonry for the bases they're standing on. So I just put 2 thin coats directly on the bases, and once we're done with that, we're ready to move on to our dry brush. And the color I decided to use for the dry brush was Dutch Aqua by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. And I used this dry brushing not just on the bases, but on all the fabric that we painted on earlier. So the green turquoise paint, the teal, Tuscan teal, as well as the holly branch paint that we used for all the fabric and all the cording these guys are using. I just dry brush all those elements as well as their bases in Dutch Aqua. It's a nice contrasting color that brings a lot of those details we couldn't see earlier. So you can see on the bases, it brings out a lot of the bob relief that we couldn't see before that was sculpted on their bases, as well as the individual folds of the fabric and the individual cording on their weapons. It does a really beautiful job of bringing those out. And now that we're done with that dry brushing, we start moving on to the metallic elements of these miniatures. So the first metallic element we're going to use on are all the silver elements on these miniatures, and we're going to use Gunmetal Gray by Folk Art. You can buy this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents, and these are for all these elements that we want to have silver on these miniatures. So things like armor plating, chainmail, the blades of their weapons are probably the major thing we're going to use. The iron banding that's inside built into their shields, so that way it looks like kind of like this Nordic kind of Celtic look with the round shields they're carrying. So for those pieces of metal that are holding it together, we pick out 2 thin layers of that as well. It's a beautiful, rich, kind of dark metallic green, metallic color that looks beautiful on the miniatures. We put that at 2 thin layers of all the silver elements, and then we're moving on to our next metallic colors. And those metallic colors are Coppers by Folk Art, as well as Emperor's Gold by Deco Art. You can get both these at your local Walmart for about 75 cents as well. So some of the elements that we picked, for example, are things like the belly plates that these guys are wearing. I decided to pick out 2 thin layers of copper for that detail. For the gold elements, we're doing things like bits of jewelry and gold coins that these guys are wearing. Same thing with any chaos iconography that's also hanging them as well, hilts of weapons, etc. So once we actually have all those silver and gold elements taken care of, as you can see, most of the miniatures are pretty much done. Now it's time for us to work on the fine details. So the fine details we decided to focus on this photo. You may not be able to see it that clearly. I do apologize for that because there's a lot of miniatures here, but a lot of these guys are wearing medallions around their necks. So in order to capture that detail, I decided to highlight that string around their necks with holly branch by Apple Barrel paint. Same thing with the cording of the weapons, or some individual cording on skulls, or bone pieces are hanging off their belts, for example. Just really small, minute details for the most part. If you see the skulls are hanging off the banner pole, the little knotting that's holding that together, I decided to pick down holly branch for that. And the last thing I decided to do as well is pick out the skulls that are based into the sculpted indirectly into the bases. I did that with Apple Barrel light mocha, so that way you can see that detail and that contrasts nicely with those bases. And once we're done with those fine elements, the next we gotta do, of course, is an oil wash. So we're going to use a single oil wash for the entire washing phase of these miniatures, and when people like to use oil washes, they tend to like to use Army Painter Strong Tone, which is a wonderful product that's exactly as advertised. The only problem though is that Army Painter Strong Tone is pretty expensive at $32.99 per can. I like to use Midwax Polyshade acrylic in Mission Oak color. You can get this at your local Walmart for about $6.99, which is about 5 times cheaper than the Army Painter stuff, and it does exactly the same thing. What the oil washing does is a couple of things. The first thing that ends up happening is that the oil wash seeps directly into the recesses of the miniatures and brings a lot of those details we couldn't see earlier. Things like the individual wood grains inside the wooden elements of the characters, the tufts of fur along them, the musculature that they actually see, the folds in the fabric, the rivets and the horns, etc. The second thing that the oil washing also does too is it smooths out the transitions between our dry brushing as well as our base coating. So you can see that chalky texture that we had before is now completely gone because those transitions have been blurred together and also kind of mixed together and smoothed out that way. And the last thing that the oil wash also does as well is it darkens down the value of the colors that we use. So you can see we're not as bright and vibrant as we were before, as darkened down those colors quite considerably. Now, just like the Army Painter Strong Tone, the Midwax Polyshade does need 24 hours to dry and cure, and the reason why is because there is polyurethane within that stain that we're using, which is exactly the same thing that Army Painter does have. So when you need to wait 24 hours for that polyurethane to dry and cure, so that way you have a nice high gloss clear coat that'll protect your miniature as well. Now, if you don't like that high gloss look, we are going to fix that by spraying some matte varnish, but of course that step is completely optional. So the last 3 things we're going to do for these miniatures is, first of all, is to rim the bases of the miniatures. We're using 2 thin coats of Territorial Beige by Apple Barrel paint, and the reason why I'm using that color is because it contrasts nicely with the teal on the bases that these guys are standing on. At the same time, but also use the same kind of color for the wood elves that I have in my Suez collection, and since the Beastmen and the wood elves both live in forest environments, I thought it'd be kind of cool to actually have that same similar color being shared by both groups. And the last step, of course, is to spray these miniatures with Krylon matte varnish. You can get this at your local Walmart for about $5.99. And the reason why I like using matte spray is because of that overall shiny high gloss finish that the polyurethane has in the Midwax Polyshade. Now, if you're a fan of that candy coated high gloss finish on your miniatures, you of course skip that step, but me, I like a matte finish on my miniatures, so I spray it real quick with some Krylon matte varnish. And once again, this is the end result that we saw earlier at the very beginning of the video. As you can see, we have a whole 20-man squad of Gors fully completed to a beautiful tabletop standard, and we saved a bunch of money at the same time by doing this by using cheap craft paint and cheaper alternative materials. So now that we're going to talk about exactly how we paint up these miniatures, let's talk about the materials that you need to buy from both Citadel as well as Army Painter if you wanted to paint up your miniatures the exact same way we did, but using those name brand products. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk about the things that you'll need to buy from both Army Painter as well as Citadel to paint exactly the same we did, except by using those name brand products. Now from Citadel, you'll need to buy Rakarth Flesh, Cadian Flesh Tone, Caliban Green, Longbeard Grey, Bane Blade Brown, Eshin Grey, Slanesh Grey, Baylor Brown, Thunderhawk Blue, Flay One Flesh, Althawan Grey, and each of those colors costs $4.55 a piece, which is about anywhere between 7 to 9 times more than the stuff that I'm actually using for my cheaper alternatives as well. Not to mention, I also get 2 fluid ounces for my tubes of paint, while I think you get like 10 milliliters with these guys. At the same time, we're also going to need Pterodon Turquoise, Wildwood, Retributor Armor, Screaming Bell, Aethermatic Blue, and Lead Belcher, and all those colors are cost $7.80 from Games Workshop, which is about 10 times as much of the craft paint that I'm using to create my stuff. And then you also need to buy a can of Army Painter color primer for brown, so that way you get that Rust-Oleum flat red that we used earlier, which will cost you $17.99 for that color. You also need to buy a can of Minotaurian varnish for $19.50, and that's assuming you want to get that matte finish for your miniatures. And then you also need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone, which will cost you $32. Now, assuming that you're purchasing everything for the very first time from both Citadel and Army Painter to paint up this squad of Gore, you're talking about a grand total of $166.34 in order to paint up your miniatures the same way we did using our Cheapskate method. Now, our Cheapskate method only costs us $27.02, so when you subtract the two, you end up with a total savings of $139.32. So there you guys have it. That's how you guys can both quickly as well as more importantly cheaply paint up your Gore for your armies of Beastmen Brayherd for Warhammer the Old World. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is valuable to us as always. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for online's greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this week, guys. We'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.